So listen to this. I'm going to be so arrogant that all of these players, they will hate me. I would look through them, wouldn't even acknowledge their presence. I wanted them to think about me and not ever have a chance to score a goal. Those were the exact words of Peter Schmeichel, explaining the psychological warfare he used to destroy the minds of Premier League strikers in the 1990s. He believed, quite simply, that if you strip a man of his confidence before the referee even blows the whistle, the battle is already won. Back then, football was a different game. It was built on intimidation. You had Roy Keane shouting in the tunnel, Patrick Vieira staring you down, Eric Cantona standing with his collar popped. The greats of that era wanted you to know that they were there to hurt you, mentally and physically. They fed off the chaos. They wanted the emotional reaction. They wanted to see the fear in your eyes. But fast forward 30 years, and that exact same psychological terrorism has been resurrected in Manchester. Only this time, it's not wearing a pair of goalkeeper gloves. It's wearing the number 9 shirt. Erling Haaland doesn't just beat defenders. He humiliates them by pretending they don't even exist. Think about it. While other strikers dive, complain to the referee, or get into shouting matches with center backs to show how tough they are, Haaland just stares. He is the first player in history to weaponize total indifference. We spend so much time talking about his ridiculous top speed, his robotic finishing, and the records he shatters every single week. But the truth is, the Premier League isn't terrified of Erling Haaland because of his physical traits. They are terrified because he treats elite, multi-million-dollar defenders like they are training cones. This is a story of how a kid from a small farming town in Norway turned arrogance into an art form, broke the mental resilience of modern football, and became the most inevitable force the sport has ever seen. But to truly understand how we got here, and to understand the cold, mechanical psychology of this monster, we have to go all the way back to the year 2000 in a hospital in Leeds, England. Because if you believe in genetics, if you believe that athletes are born and not made, then Erling Haaland was quite literally built in a lab. His father, Alfie Haaland, was a hard-tackling, ruthless defensive midfielder playing in the Premier League. A man who famously stood over Roy Keane after a horrific injury and yelled at him to stop faking it, a decision that would ultimately lead to Keane snapping Alfie's knee in half a few years later in one of the most infamous acts of revenge in football history. And his mother, Gry Marita Braut, was a national champion in the heptathlon in Norway. For those who don't know, the heptathlon is arguably the most grueling track and field event in existence, requiring an athlete to master 7 different disciplines, from sprinting to shot put to the high jump. So before Erling even took his first breath, his DNA was programmed for absolute physical dominance. In fact, believe it or not, when he was just 5 years old, he recorded a standing long jump of 1.63 meters. That wasn't just a good jump for a kid. That was a literal world record for a 5-year-old that still stands to this day. However, following his father's forced retirement due to that devastating knee injury, the family packed up and moved away from the bright lights of England. They moved to Bryne, a tiny, quiet farming town on the rainy western coast of Norway. And this is where the silence began. Bryne was not a place of luxury. It was an agricultural community where people worked hard and didn't talk much. And for a young Erling, his entire world revolved around a local indoor artificial pitch called the Jer Hallen. Now, you would think that a genetic freak like him would just bully kids his own age, but the coaches at Bryne FK saw something different. When he was just 8 years old, they moved him up to play with the under 11S. A year later, he was playing against kids who were 3, sometimes 4 years older than him. And here is the plot twist that nobody talks about. For a long time, Erling Haaland was tiny. Because he hadn't hit his growth spurt yet, he was the smallest, skinniest kid on the pitch. He couldn't rely on his strength. If he tried to hold off a 1-4-year-old defender, he would get destroyed. So he had to adapt. He had to learn how to play entirely in the shadows. He spent years mastering the art of hiding in the blind spot of the center back. He learned that if you don't engage physically, if you stay completely silent and wait for the exact fraction of a second when the defender turns his head, you can kill them with one movement. This wasn't just tactical training. This was the foundation of his psychological warfare. He learned early on that the greatest weapon a striker has isn't his muscles, it's his patience. By the time he was 15, he finally hit that inevitable growth spurt, and it hit him like a freight train. He grew nearly 8 inches in a ridiculously short amount of time, packing on muscle so fast that his own body couldn't keep up. He developed Osgood-Schlatter disease, a painful condition in his knees caused by his bones growing faster than his tendons. For a brief period, he was a giant who didn't know how to coordinate his own limbs. Despite the awkwardness, he was given his senior debut for Bryne in the second division of Norwegian football. He played 16 games. He scored 0 goals. 0. For any normal teenager, failing to score in 16 professional games would shatter their confidence. They would start questioning if they were really meant for this level. But Haaland, he didn't care. The arrogance was already deeply rooted. He knew the goals were coming. He just needed a manager who knew how to unlock the machine. And that manager was Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. When Molde, one of Norway's biggest clubs, signed a 16-year-old Haaland, Solskjaer, a legendary Manchester United striker famously known as the baby-faced assassin, took one look at him and realized the kid had the physical tools of a god, but the heading ability of a child. So Solskjaer put him through absolute hell. In training, Solskjaer and his assistants would cross the ball into the box and literally physically wrestle with Haaland, pulling his shirt, pushing him off balance, forcing him to learn how to use his new massive frame. Solskjaer forced him to sit in a film room and watch hours of Cristiano Ronaldo's movement inside the penalty area. He taught him that being big wasn't enough. You had to be violent but precise. And then came the game against SK Bryne. In July 2018, Bryne was sitting at the top of the league. They were unbeaten. They had the best defense in the country. Molde was struggling. Solskjaer decided to start the 17-year-old Haaland. What happened next is the moment the monster was truly born. In the 4th minute, Haaland scored. In the 13th minute, he scored again. In the 15th minute, he got his hat trick. In the 21st minute, he scored his 4th goal. 4 goals away from home against the unbeaten league leaders in just 21 minutes. And the most terrifying part wasn't the goals themselves, it was his reaction. When he scored the 4th, a powerful penalty, he didn't run to the corner flag screaming, he didn't take his shirt off, he simply jogged back to the center circle, face completely deadpan, looking at the Bryne defenders as if he had just completed a mile training drill. Sitting in the stands that day were scouts from Juventus and Manchester United. They came to watch a prospect. They left realizing they had just witnessed a biological weapon. But if you thought what he did in Norway was just a fluke, a big fish in a small pond, then the 30th of May 2019 changed everything. It was the Under-20 World Cup in Poland. Norway was playing Honduras. Usually in these youth tournaments, when a team goes up 3-0 or 4-0, they take their foot off the gas. The striker might try some fancy tricks, maybe assist a teammate, preserve energy for the next round. But Haaland doesn't understand the concept of mercy. He scored the first goal in the 7th minute. By halftime, he had 4. But instead of resting, he came out in the second half looking genuinely angry that he hadn't scored more. He scored in the 50th, the 67th, the 77th, the 88th, and the 90th minute. He scored 9 goals in a single FIFA World Cup match. 9. It was an act of sheer, terrifying gluttony. It was a statement to the world that he was never, ever going to be satisfied. That performance secured his move to Red Bull Salzburg in Austria, a club famous for pressing, high intensity, and developing raw talent. Under American manager Jesse Marsch, Haaland was introduced to the Champions League. And this is where the global psychological warfare truly began. On the 17th of September, 2019, a 19-year-old Erling Haaland walked out of the tunnel for his Champions League debut against Genk. Most teenagers in that situation would be terrified. The lights, the music, the pressure, but there is a famous video clip from that night that tells you everything you need to know about his brain. As the iconic Champions League anthem played, the camera panned across the faces of the Salzburg players. They looked nervous, focused, staring straight ahead, and then the camera landed on Haaland. He was staring dead into the lens with a massive, almost psychotic smile on his face. He wasn't feeling the pressure. He was feeding off it. 45 minutes later, he had scored a hat trick. He became the first teenager since Wayne Rooney to score a hat trick on his Champions League debut. But unlike Rooney, who played with raw emotional fire, Haaland played with a chilling efficiency. He went on to score against Liverpool at Anfield. He scored twice against Napoli. He became the first teenager in history to score in 5 consecutive Champions League matches. The elite defenders of Europe were starting to realize they had a massive problem on their hands. You couldn't bully him because he was 6'4" and built like a tank. You couldn't outrun him because he had the sprint speed of an Olympic sprinter. And you couldn't get into his head because he simply didn't care that you existed. Because the moment he stepped foot in Germany after signing for Borussia Dortmund in January 2020, it stopped being a football match and started being a horror movie for Bundesliga center backs. His debut for Dortmund is the stuff of legends. They were playing away against FC Augsburg. Dortmund was losing 3-1. The team looked completely defeated. In the 56th minute, the manager sent Haaland onto the pitch. Keep in mind, he had barely trained with his new teammates. 3 minutes later, he scored. 11 minutes after that, he scored again. 9 minutes later, he sealed his hat trick. A debut hat trick off the bench in just 23 minutes to turn a 3-1 defeat into a 5-3 victory. But scoring goals against lower-tier teams is one thing. The true test of his psychological dominance came when Dortmund faced RB Leipzig. Leipzig's defense was anchored by Dayot Upamecano. At the time, Upamecano was widely considered the most terrifying physical specimen in European defense. He was huge, incredibly fast, and loved to physically destroy strikers. Strikers hated playing against him because he would hit you hard and early, letting you know it was going to be a long 90 minutes. When the game started, Upamecano tried to do exactly that to Haaland. He tried to get physical. He tried to engage him in a wrestling match. And what did Haaland do? He ignored him. For large parts of the game, Haaland just jogged away from him, letting Upamecano shadow him pointlessly. But then a long ball was played over the top. Upamecano, confident in his pace and strength, ran shoulder to shoulder with the Norwegian. And in a moment that shocked the entire Bundesliga, Haaland didn't just hold him off. He literally bounced Upamecano into the grass like a little kid. He completely shrugged off one of the strongest men in football, ran through on goal, and scored. The look on Upamecano's face as he sat on the turf was one of pure disbelief. His entire identity as an unbreakable physical wall had been shattered in 3 seconds. That is what Haaland does. He breaks your ego, and he does it with his terrifying silence. Have you ever watched his post-match interviews during his time at Dortmund? A reporter would ask him a long, complicated question about his emotions, about the tactical setup, about how it feels to score 2 goals in front of the yellow wall. And Haaland would just look at him with dead eyes and say, "Yeah, it was good," and then stop talking. The reporters would nervously laugh, waiting for him to continue, but he wouldn't. He gave them nothing. No emotion, no insight, no humanity. Just cold, robotic efficiency. Which brings us to the ultimate evolution of the weapon, Manchester City. When it was announced that Pep Guardiola was signing Erling Haaland, the football world was split. Yes, City needed a striker, but Guardiola's entire philosophy was built on control. Pep is famously known as a control freak, a manager who micromanages every pass, every space, every rotation. For years, he played with a false nine, using midfielders like Kevin De Bryne, Phil Foden, or Bernardo Silva in the striker position. He hated traditional strikers because they were chaotic, they lost the ball, they didn't participate in the 1-0-0 pass buildups. Ibrahimovic failed under Pep at Barcelona. Eto'o was pushed out. Everyone thought Haaland would disrupt City's beautiful machine. They thought Pep would try to turn Haaland into a creative midfielder, forcing him to drop deep, link up play, and completely ruin what made him special. But Pep Guardiola did the exact opposite. He didn't ask Haaland to drop deep like Messi. He didn't ask him to press relentlessly for 90 minutes. He simply pointed at the penalty box and said, "Wait." And this is where the nightmare deepens for the opposition. To understand just how strange Haaland's psychology is under Guardiola, you have to look at the contrast. Prime Diego Costa, Luis Suarez, or Wayne Rooney, their greatness was built on emotion. They thrived in the chaos. They wanted to argue with the referee. They wanted to scream at the crowd. They wanted the defender to know that it was personal. But let's analyze Haaland's body language during a typical Premier League match for Manchester City. Usually, a center back's job is to establish dominance early. A subtle elbow, a late challenge, a word whispered in the ear. It's a test to see if the striker will bite. When they try this on Haaland, what happens? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He doesn't turn around to complain. He doesn't glare at the defender. He simply fixes his hair, adjusts his socks, and jogs back to his position. But here is where the psychological torture begins. For the next 80 minutes, he won't engage in any physical battle. He doesn't have to. You aren't just fighting Haaland. You are fighting a system designed to isolate you with a monster. Imagine playing center back against Manchester City. You spend 85 minutes exhausted chasing shadows, trying to stop De Bruyne, Foden, and Rodri from passing you to death. Your brain is fried, your legs are heavy. You are shifting left and right, terrified of the wingers. And out of the corner of your eye, you see him, still standing there, hiding in your blind spot, moving at walking pace. He makes the center back feel safe. He tricks them into a false sense of security. He might end the game with only 8 touches of the ball, 8 touches in 90 minutes. For any other player, that is a disaster. For Haaland, it is a master class. The moment the center back relaxes for a fraction of a second, the switch is flipped. It's a sudden, violent burst of acceleration, a perfectly timed run across the front post, one touch, goal. He doesn't go back to taunt the defender who hit him in the first minute. He just runs to the corner flag, sits in a meditative pose, and shuts his eyes. And as that defender looks over at him, standing in the middle of a screaming stadium, realizing that this kid just completely dismantled him with 3 touches of the ball in the entire game, that is when the true terror sets in. Schmeichel wanted players to hate him. Haaland doesn't even give them the privilege of being hated. He treats elite Premier League defenders like they are irrelevant. Yet, every machine, no matter how perfectly engineered, has a stress limit. And to find Erling Haaland's breaking point, you have to take him out of the flawless billion-dollar system of Manchester City and put him in the red kit of Norway. Up until now, we've looked at Haaland as a psychological terrorist operating inside a perfect environment. If he doesn't score for City, De Bruyne will. If De Bruyne doesn't, Foden will. But when he puts on that national team kit, everything changes. The cold, unbothered arrogance, it disappears. Because for Norway, if Erling Haaland doesn't score, a nation of 5 million people watches their dreams die. Football history is filled with generational talents who were cursed by their passports. George Best, Ryan Giggs, players who conquered Europe with their clubs but were forced to watch the World Cup on their televisions at home. For a long time, it looked like Haaland was doomed to the exact same fate. Watching the 2022 World Cup in Qatar from his living room wasn't just a disappointment. For a competitor of his ego, it was absolute humiliation. While his rival, Kylian Mbappe, was scoring a historic hat-trick in a World Cup final, Haaland was sitting in the cold Norwegian winter, completely powerless. And that powerlessness did something to him. It stripped away his silence. It created a desperation we had never seen before. The road to the 2026 World Cup in North America wasn't a football campaign for Norway. It was a survival mission. And Haaland knew he could no longer just stand in the penalty box and wait for the perfect pass. He had to become something else. He had to become a dictator on the pitch. During the qualifiers, we saw a completely different Erling Haaland. The boy who never complained suddenly screamed at his midfielders when a pass was late. The striker who never dropped deep was suddenly tackling players in his own half, winning the ball back by sheer force of will. Defenders who tried to play mind games with him on the international stage didn't get the silent treatment anymore. They met a man who was fighting for his legacy. He wasn't just carrying the ball. He was dragging an entire country across the finish line. When Norway finally stepped onto the pitch for the 2026 World Cup, the atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just another tournament. This was the moment the monster was unleashed on the biggest stage in human history. But the psychological warfare was entirely different. Against the tactical brilliance of South American and elite European defenses on the World Cup stage, his sheer physical dominance wasn't enough. They tried to isolate him. They put 2, sometimes 3 men on him, kicking him, crowding him, refusing to give him an inch of space. Yet, this is where the true genius of Haaland's mentality shone through. Instead of growing frustrated like the superstars of the past, he used his own gravity as a weapon. He sacrificed his own touches, dragging entire defensive lines out of position, running into empty corners of the pitch just to pull 3 defenders with him, allowing his teammates like Martin Odegaard to exploit the massive empty spaces left behind. He showed the world that he wasn't just a goal scorer, he was a gravitational anomaly. It takes a very specific type of arrogance to believe you only need a handful of moments to destroy an entire team's game plan. Peter Schmeichel used arrogance to hide his fears. He wanted the attackers to think he was invincible before they even took a shot. But Erling Haaland's journey proved something far more terrifying. He doesn't need to hide behind arrogance anymore. Whether he is the silent assassin standing motionless in the flawless system of Manchester City, or the screaming, desperate captain trying to carry Norway on his broken back, the result is exactly the same. You can study his movements, you can analyze his psychology, you can even put 3 of the best defenders in the world on him. But in the end, it just doesn't matter, because you are not playing against a man. You are playing against an inevitability. It is no longer just football. It is the absolute destruction of hope.